Hello and welcome. We're going to start off with a disclaimer tonight for this masterclass, and that is that this presentation is for educational and informational purposes only. It's not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. The information shared does not replace professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult a licensed healthcare provider before making any health-related decisions. The presenters are not licensed medical doctors and do not prescribe or diagnose medical conditions. That being said, welcome to our class tonight. Tonight, we are exploring the nature of respiratory issues like asthma throughout different cultures from a global perspective. I'm Michelle.
And I'm Matthew.
And we're here to teach.
All right.
All right. So our quote this evening,
Slideshow.
Nope. Yep. Wrong button. Okay. Our quote for this evening is by Lao Tzu, and it says, "Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished."
Right. So when you think of like classical respiratory issues or even like something like asthma, there's, different movies, different documentaries and different things that I've come across, but usually, right, it's, your asthma acts up because you're overdoing what the body is capable of doing. And some individuals have explored strengthening their endurance and stamina to not be as affected by their asthma. Right. So it really is nature's way of like telling you possibly to kind of slow down and take a minute. And so it does get interesting when you start looking at truly what we're trying to teach, which are ways that the body is communicating to you and exploring and furthering your awareness of what we've classically defined as different symptoms and conditions in the US or in the Western medical society.
So what if these indicators, these symptoms as we're talking about them, are actually the solution? What if it's your body communicating something that needs a deeper look or a deeper exploration? And for us, we're defining symptom as a falling together. So this just means that it's departing from a normal function to serve as an expression of imbalance. And again, your body is always communicating with you. It's always trying to communicate with you. Sometimes it's just a matter of understanding how it's communicating and what that message might be. So we're going to introduce ourselves and go through this topic from a global perspective and talk about some of the ways that the body communicates this, and then talk about some ways you can inspire your own wellness at home and share some experiences, including my own, because I had asthma from a very early age and was able to identify the root cause of the asthma. And I have not had asthma or any bouts of asthma in probably 8 years at this point. So again, I'm Michelle.
I'm Matthew.
And we're here to teach. The word doctor actually means to teach from within. So we're hoping that the information we provide for you can allow you to explore your health in a different way. So what if your airways tighten because your nervous system is in fight or flight mode, and not necessarily because of allergens? Now, don't get me wrong, allergens are one of the things we're going to talk about, but there's also a central nervous system component to breathing issues that comes into play.
Right, because we're all breathing the same thing. Why does one person next to you have no botherings of all those same allergens in the air, and then the other person does?
Yeah.
So there's obviously more to it than just looking at it from one dimension.
So let's dive into the Western perspective of asthma first. So in the Western perspective, it's inflammation and an overactive immune response. So imagine that you're sitting in a doctor's office and you expect them to give you a prescription for an inhaler which is what I got when I went in with asthma. They said, here's a long-term inhaler, here's a short-term inhaler. Oh, and by the way, because yours is coupled with allergies, you're going to have to get shots every other week for the rest of your life. That's what I was told when I was in, it was late elementary or early middle school. And so that's what I did. I had an emergency inhaler that I used 4 times a day. I had a long-term inhaler with that I used every day or every other day as needed. And then I also had allergen shots that I had to get from a specialist in an office across town every other week. And I had to get multiple shots at a time. And I did that from early childhood. So I would again say it was probably late elementary, early middle school, all the way until I went off to college.
Now, when it comes to the Western world, I mean, it gets interesting because I know that we talked about allergens and two people can have different immune functions, but one of the things that they actually do is they prescribe, I've seen medical doctors prescribe a change in altitude.
Mm.
Because at high altitude, oxygen is lower, yet many asthmatics report improved symptoms because of the reduced exposure of pollutants, right? So like, it's kind of crazy here in Sedona, and even when I was living in Prescott at a time, there it was they didn't have the exhaust. You don't have to get your exhaust checked by your car because there's not enough cars at this high altitude in this city. There's not enough environmental toxins from cars being produced in the air for them to even warrant you to have your car inspected like it was when I was living in Dallas, right? When I was in Dallas, you always had to get your car inspected to make sure that it passed EPA qualifications.
Yeah.
So, it is interesting that yes, allergens, like Michelle said, does have an effect, but it's just interesting that they've kind of done those kind of studies and looks. And so it's just interesting to consider, what is your environment? Are you living near, an airport?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we've had people live near airports and they do come across more often than others, breathing issues.
Mhm.
So again, it's just, something to pay attention to. I mean, there's a lot to pay attention to, but if you're just aware of your present moment and your surroundings, there's a lot of things you can learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a lot of times, at least for my experience, if I went into a Western medical doctor's office, I would expect them to give me an inhaler prescription and prescribe shots and all these other things because that's what happened to me. But what if instead the doctor says, well, this isn't about your lungs, it's actually your immune system in overdrive, which I learned much, much later. For me, that was actually the case. So imagine that your body thinks it's under attack, or your body thinks it's under attack, and we need to calm the storm, not silence the alarm. So instead of getting a bronchial dilator or a vasodilator or a steroidal inhaler, they instead prescribe anti-inflammatory diets, stress management, and gut health as part of that conversation. So how my asthma actually went away was I rebuilt my immune system with food and with a few supplements. And once my immune system kind of had a 9-week overhaul, all of a sudden I didn't need my inhaler anymore. And it happened almost overnight for me, which was wonderfully surprising because I went from needing that inhaler 4 times a day to not needing it at all to several months later. I don't even know where I put it to several years later. Doesn't matter that I don't know where I put it.
And it's also interesting because in that world of, gut health that they explore in the Western medicine, it's good that they explore that because there is a microbial hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
That you want to maybe not intentionally expose them to like crazy stuff, but when you're younger, it is good to get dirty and explore and get exposed to diverse microbes. So like they did a study where rates of asthma actually had skyrocketed in industrialized nations where they weren't exposed to a lot of different microbes like farmers or those in rural settings that were just out and about and just being exposed all the time. And so it does get interesting because then your body's immune system and everything can be strengthened.
Yeah.
Everything. the way that you study, the way that you remember, the way that you do push-ups, the way your immune system responds, the way that you breathe, right? If I remember Dr. Ellen saying that, she spent, 2 years in the Swiss Alps studying just breathing. And I would imagine if you really focus on that deep breathing, like your lungs, right, will get stronger, but not just your physiological, but your biochemical will get stronger and your immune system will get stronger, I would imagine. So it gets really interesting when you start paying attention to all the different, again, things that, you do.
And it's not to say that people don't have different starting points. For example, they've shown that kids who are born through C-section tend to have more immune related issues because the vaginal canal of the woman as she gives birth is actually what primes the baby's own immune system. And then if they're breastfed or not, again, the mom's breast milk is one of those things that informs the child's immune system. So kids who have been born through C-section and who are not breastfed, who are bottle fed right away, they tend to have a slightly higher incident of immune related stuff, asthma, different bronchial issues, stuff like that. But that's not to say that that's the same across the board. I, for example, was born vaginally and was completely breastfed, and I still ended up with asthma, as a child. But like Matthew was saying, there's also a huge epigenetic component. And that means the ability for our bodies to adapt and change to different environments, to different inputs, to different information. And so it is completely possible, as I later proved to myself, that I could change my body's immune perspective so that it could act and react and interact with my environment very differently in my adulthood than it did in my childhood. So from this Western perspective, we're asking ourselves to consider, what if asthma isn't a lung issue, but a full body signal that your immune system is misfiring? So that's one perspective to take. Then in the traditional Chinese medicine perspective, they're looking more at lungs and unprocessed grief. So imagine that in ancient China, a healer doesn't just listen to your wheezing, but they also ask about your emotions. In traditional Chinese medicine, the lungs are where grief lives. They're the seat of grief. So they ask, is there sorrow you have yet to exhale? So acupuncture, herbal formulas, and qigong, which is breathing and movement, might be prescribed, not just to open the airways, but to also release stuck emotions that someone might be holding on to. And you actually hear this pretty often when people get into different exercise practices that require a lot of deep breathing. A lot of times they'll say, I've had such a huge emotional release after doing these exercises, because that breathing can release a lot of stuff. So from the Chinese perspective, the consideration is, what if asthma isn't just a reaction to allergens, but an emotional imprint that your lungs have yet to release? And even in like the Tibetan traditions, they look at asthma as more of a relationship between the kidneys and the lungs. So they're again looking at how it ties into other areas of the body too. They're not just relegating it to the lungs and the lungs only.
And it's interesting speaking about grief, right? Because, at least, everyone's gone through heartbreak.
Mm.
And when you do, or at least for me, I don't sleep that much when I'm going through unprocessed grief, and my sleep can get really bad during that time. And it's, it's interesting because, they kind of say, some people say that, some asthma attacks happen, why do they happen at night? Nighttime asthma attacks often align to the body's natural circadian rhythms. So cortisol, right, which naturally suppresses inflammation, is lowest at night, leaving the airways more reactive. So essentially, could optimizing sleep cycles. So, you got to imagine there's so many trickle effects to the most exterior part to what we're experiencing that we don't even realize, that you want to check in with yourself with different factors and different things. I'm not saying that if you're not sleeping at night, that has to do with grief, right? It could be a lot of different emotional components. It could be that you're overworked. It could be, well, you just don't sleep that much, right? And so, but these are all different perspectives to get you to be able to check in with yourself, because ultimately that's what we want to teach you is how to truly check in with yourself in a unique way.
Yeah. And in Ayurvedic medicine, asthma is seen as an imbalance of air and fire. Remember, Ayurvedic medicine uses the different dosha types, and these tie into different elements that are found in nature. So in Ayurvedic, they might say the air moves too wildly while the heat inflames the lungs, creating a perfect storm. So an Ayurvedic healer wouldn't just treat breath work, they'd also ask about diet, stress, and lifestyle. So they'd say, okay, cool the fire, which could indicate certain types of foods or combining certain foods. They could say ground the wind, which could mean things like more warming spices, more time spent with your feet on the ground outside, things like that. And slow, calming breath work, in addition to other herbal remedies like maybe licorice or tulsi. So, for that perspective, we would consider what if asthma isn't just about breathing, but about a balance between movement and stability in your life?
And there's some interesting things about Ayurvedic, So there's something called the breathwork paradox, which can less be more. So we might always think, and we even talk about this, that we talk about doing deep belly breathing,
Mhm.
but there's also some really unique techniques like pranayama that suggest that controlled, shallow breathing may actually improve oxygenation and reduce asthma-like symptoms. Right. So could retaining breath be key in long-term kind of control? And that's what they talk about here. So a lot of times they will, do breath work, and it's controlled breath work. And it's not necessarily about it being shallow breath, right? Because they talk about slow breath work, not necessarily that it's shallow or deep. So it just gets interesting, again,
The speed of breath can change how the body is interacting too. You may have heard of the Wim Hof method, which is a type of breathing exercise that helps keep the body temperature up in cold environments. And so there's a huge range of types of breath work that can actually help move the body in and out of different states, which is really fascinating. Speaking of breath, in ancient Egypt, we're looking at the spirit of the breath. So, to ancient Egyptians, breath really was life itself. It was this expression of the divinity of you. And so, to them, asthma was not just an illness, it was a disruption of your sacred life force known as Ka. So, in that case, a priestess might prepare a remedy of honey and frankincense and perform rituals at the same time. They'd say, the breath is sacred. Where has your spirit lost its rhythm? So, consider what if asthma isn't just a physical condition, but a sign that your breath or your life force has fallen out of sync somehow?
And you can see this in the concept, if we wanted to ground this in the hidden role of the vagus nerve, right? So asthma
Mm.
isn't just about the lungs, as we just said, in many ways. It's tied to your autonomic nervous system, right? The vagus nerve, which controls inflammation and airway constriction, and it can play a possible direct role into asthma attacks. So it gets really interesting. Yeah, the Egyptians were already onto something, saying that it's the spirit. And we know that, at least I feel like when I relate spirit into something physiological into the body, I would say the autonomic nervous system is that, right? It's an electrical conduction, circuit breaker box for your entire body. And so it really is, that kind of spirit within the concept of the body.
So, then in the Mesoamerican and Toltec traditions, we're looking at the perspective of blocked pathways to power. So, in Mesoamerican cultures, the lungs were seen as the gateway between the physical and the spiritual world. So, this is actually kind of similar to the Egyptian perspective of it being related to your life force. So, in the Mesoamerican tradition, asthma could mean that your energy or your tonal, which is your more 3D, was trapped and unable to move freely through your body. So healers would use cacao, sweat lodges, and drumming to restore flow. They'd say, your breath is your power. Where have you been holding back? So from that perspective, we would consider, what if asthma isn't just a physical struggle, but a message that something in your life needs to be set free?
Yeah.
So now let's bring it back to the present moment. Step into your own experience, whether you view asthma through the lens of medicine, energy, or spirit. The thing that seems to be the same across the board is that breath is essential to life. So what if asthma isn't a problem to fix, but simply a signal to explore? What if instead of just opening the airway, you ask, what is my breath trying to tell me? So if you've ever had any breathing issues or respiratory issues, or if you've experienced asthma yourself, which one of these perspectives resonates the most with you? The Western perspective of it being more immune related, the Chinese perspective of it being an emotional imprint that you need to release, the Ayurvedic perspective about the balance between movement and stability in your life, the Egyptian perspective of a sign that your life force has fallen out of sync, or the Toltec Mesoamerican perspective of something in your life that needs to be set free. So when you think asthma, think clearing. When the breath is restricted, there might be something deeper asking to be cleared. So what if these blockages are physical or emotional or environmental? What if your body simply needs clearing through either fresh air, clearing out toxicities, breath training, or mindful movement? I know for me, it was clearing out toxicities that had been built up over time. So how does the body communicate asthma in other ways? When we do reviews with people, one of the things we're looking at is iridology. Iridology is the study of looking at images of the eyes close up and seeing the different genetic potentials that are passed down throughout families and generations. So blue eyes, also known as lymphatic types, have a higher potential for overactive immune responses because they tend to have more congestion in the lymphatic fluid, which is how your body carries toxins out of the body. So one of those potential overactive immune responses could be asthma. Another way that we might see this is when the pupil is super large. See how big that pupil is in comparison to the rest of the eye? If it's that large and it's fixed like that, meaning it primarily stays that large, one of the reasons for this could be that the body is in constant fight or flight mode. You see this a lot in children who've experienced a lot of trauma. So like Matthew mentioned, with that vagus nerve being such an important part of this story, of this big picture, this is one of the things to consider. Something else that might be considered is, are the pupils different? In other words, is one a nice normal round shape and the other one in this kind of odd ellipsis that's pointing a certain direction? That can be related to asthma or breathing issues. When we're looking at the tongue, some areas where this could be communicated is, is if the tongue is quite pale with a thin white coating. That can indicate a energy deficiency in the lungs. And then if the tongue is also swollen with teeth marks on the side, that can be related to the spleen, which does have immune indications, and it can be an accumulation of dampness. And when there's more dampness, there might be more tendency toward breathing imbalance. Now, on the voice wise, you would be looking for shortness of breath. And this can show up in so many places because, again, your breath can indicate so many different things. And that's why it's so fun to explore what it could be communicating for you, because there's so many different possibilities because each person is so unique. So what are some ways to support clearing? Sorry. Well, as you can see, there are quite a few. So one of the approaches is steam inhalation. You can use thyme or oregano oil if it's feeling like there's a lot of mucus and buildup. HEPA filters are a great idea to have in your house. So we actually have one ourselves that we quite like, and it covers a very large radius, and it just makes the air in the house not feel quite so stagnant, because you could open doors and windows, but sometimes the weather doesn't really allow for that. So having some sort of a filter in the house is also a really great idea. You can also diffuse something like eucalyptus oil. Eucalyptus is wonderful for, breath and respiratory. And so if I ever feel like my nose is getting a little bit clogged, I actually just keep a small bottle of eucalyptus oil on my bedside table. And all I have to do is rub a little bit of that inside my nose, and then I sleep just fine. And those nasal passageways stay open for me so that I can sleep. And for me, that's a much better option than using like some sort of a nose spray, which I know, has downsides as well as benefits. I'd much rather use the eucalyptus oil personally. Something else that's really great for especially a lot of mucus and like when the cough feels really wet is going to be mullein tea. Mullein tea is great for mucus. You can also use the Chinese approaches of gua sha or cupping on the upper back. Cupping uses a process called moxibustion that is thought to help eliminate toxicity through the skin. And when I was living over in China, I used to get cupping done, and I would walk around because it was quite warm in the summer. I would walk around and I would have all the little bruises on my back. And so all the Chinese people would like point to their friends and point at me and say, "Oh, look, the foreigner got cupping. The foreigner got cupping." So they thought that was really amusing for some reason. Um, you can also drink pear and honey tea if the lungs feel a bit too dry, because that's going to actually help with the moisture. Then there are two particular acupressure points that are supposed to strengthen lung function and clear out phlegm. And that's going to be the lung 9 point, LU9, and also stomach 40. So those are two points that you can look up, and it'll show you on Google where to press, where those points are. Turmeric and Tulsi tea are also thought to be helpful. Remember, Tulsi tea was one of the global recommendations that we explored together earlier. Massaging the chest with warm sesame oil and eucalyptus. So back to that eucalyptus oil, because that's another just great way to use it. Alternate nostril breathing is more thought to clear energy blockages than work on the breath itself. So that brings in the energy component. Frankincense resin is thought to really purify the air. So if maybe you don't have a HEPA filter, that would be an alternative to try. Cacao, and again, one of those global remedies that was mentioned. And you could even add cayenne and cinnamon in it because those are both great for circulation. Warm salt steam baths are also a fun idea. And then humming exercises, even though that helps to vibrate and loosen mucus, humming also stimulates the vagus nerve. And as Matthew mentioned, the vagus nerve is also often tied into breathing. And then also spending time in sunlight to just support your overall mental well-being, because time outside and being connected to the natural rhythms of life go a really long way for supporting your health. In terms of some real life experiences, we got some information from a 46-year-old who was doing a breathwork class. And she said that after doing breathwork class for several weeks, I noticed that my asthma was better, even though I got sick. So she was someone whose asthma used to get worse when she was feeling poorly. But because she'd been doing breath work, it actually helped to strengthen that area of herself. And so even when she got sick, she felt like her asthma was not as acute. And for myself, I ate vegetables for 9 weeks straight. And after I did, it really reset my immune system. And so I no longer had asthma or allergies or thyroid issues or even the ADHD that I had been diagnosed with before. So I realized just how much nutrition and rebuilding my immune system helped to address all of my underlying imbalances all at once. For me, it was a lot of gut and immune related stuff. And that's where we're going to end our recording for today. Thanks for joining.